Welcome to the Global WeSpace Summit, a first-of-its-kind online journey into collective consciousness and practice. For this event, over 150 trailblazing pioneers and WeSpace experts from North America and Europe have been invited to share their latest insights and reflections on this subject. Bringing our best discernment inside these conversations, the many approaches of each WeSpace lineage come to life. As we explore pathways into the collective development and transformation of our lives and culture at this time, we are delighted to have you join us on this journey.
Welcome, friends on the call, friends listening to the call. I am with three teachers of the Trillium Awakening, and we'll be having a panel here about how the WeSpace shows up in the context of their work. And before we dive into content, I want to just introduce all of the squares on the screen that include people in them. So the first is Sandra Glickman. She's a lifelong investigator of transpersonal integrated studies with a focus on consciousness, as well as a study of typologies, including the Enneagram, human design, and somatic experiencing, as well as other systems that serve for pattern recognition of our egoic structure and shadow in service of healing. She's been a psychotherapist for the better part of 3 decades and a senior teacher in Trillium Awakening, and trains new teachers and leaders within this stream of dharma, as well as supports the upgrading of the organizational and teaching structures. And she has participated in many different yogic communities, including working with Adida. And then we have Cielle Backstrom. Spanning more than 4 decades, Cielle's psycho-spiritual path has broadened to include several modalities. In 1972, she became a teacher of TM. She was a pivotal member of a small team which established the Liberal Catholic Church in Fairfield, Iowa in 1985. And since then, she has completed training as an inner relationship focusing professional, an energy healer certified by the Four Winds Society, a senior teacher in the embodied awakening path of Trillium Awakening, and a holotropic breathwork facilitator. She offers private sessions, weekend intensives, and retreats, and uses the tools she's learned to support clients in awakening to their true and total nature. And last but not least is Gilbert. Fax has been a Trillium Awakening teacher for 10 years, along with his wife Sharon, and has taught meditation and led spiritual retreats for over 30 years throughout the US and the world. And concurrently, he uses the performance skills of mime, masks, and magic as an educational tool, and has delivered over 5,000 school assembly programs on character development, bullying, and health as state history, plays, and creative dramatics residencies throughout the Midwest since 1990. And Fax sees the creation of collective mutual WeSpace as integral to spiritual awakening and the ownership of who we are as consciousness, who we are as a person, and who we are in the world. Well, that just makes me more interested to have this conversation, to hear more who I'm talking about, talking to. So I really wanted to, so much for me about the WeSpace is how do we track what's most alive, what has the most energy? And I would love for us to just start this dialogue with leading with a question of what most excites you about the WeSpace in general as a possibility and expression in consciousness, and what most excites you about WeSpace in the context of Trillium Awakening. So general WeSpace and the context of this work, what's most exciting or enlivening for you? Whoever would like to go first?
Well, for me, the WeSpace is something that's activated in improvisation, theater work, where you don't know where you're going. There's you and your partner, and maybe there's a direction that's given. But other than that, it's just tuning into the collected field that you create together. And it's the surprises that come out of that are interesting to me. And I find similar magic in the Trillium work with students, in group work and on one-on-one situations where just being together without any particular direction, with a little bit of clarification that with things that are coming up, and it's just the field seems to get enlivened and magic starts to happen.
Nice.
I think for me, because I've spent decades really walking a path towards and then stepping on and furthering on to awakening, implications that a shared we space has in fostering awakening is just, it's just magical. I mean, just Vax used that word too, but I did a lot of time in silent meditation, and then even silent meditation in large group settings of literally 2,000 people meditating in close proximity in the same building or a couple of buildings side by side, for extended periods of times, maybe 3 to 4 or 5 hours. But it wasn't interactional. And the magic of having people come together in the present moment, keeping their attention on what is the larger ground of being that's holding this space and interacting, bringing up their own personhood into that interaction, is such a rich, rich, rich field that it excites me. And then specifically with Trillium Awakening, we do have a container that's very flexible, but it still has enough boundaries to keep that present moment expression very safe and sacred. So I really love that over the years, that kind of containered simplicity and its effectiveness has been developed in this Trillium work. And, of course, we can talk more about this as the interview continues if needed, but I'm just really impressed with the container that was so simply set through this Trillium work.
Great.
I think for me, it's like the inclusive factor, like anything can be included. And because of the container that we have cultivated over time, all those bits of conversation are known and felt in that sacred space of just receiving what is. And it is true that surprisingly, there sometimes emerges a theme which builds and builds and becomes more nuanced. And it keeps people, curious and intrigued and engaged. And generally, as we go around in the we space, the zest for life, the elan, magnifies so that people really are uplifted. And I think, that the participation of the individual in a collective supportive space is like the perfect kind of like melding of that paradox of individual and collective. And that is enlivening. That's what I like about it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious about a couple of things that people said here. Cielle, you said that there was a focus in the we space of the ground of being. And I've certainly been in groups where that awareness was in the background. And I've also been in groups where that wasn't, where it was more like emergent realities coming in, or transparency is how we're getting into the access point to the we space. So I'm just curious, what are some of the access points that you've felt in the context of your work where it's like, oh, wow, we're there. Maybe we did it from spiritual direction here. Maybe we just did it from saying our truth here. Like, what are some of the access points you found most readily available to the we space feeling?
Oh, I can just give you an example of how it was activated for me. We had a retreat a couple of weeks ago, and people were going around. They'd done some work where people were just bringing up what I'm feeling in the moment, what's present for me. And they were doing that individually. And then we started to do it as a group. And as people went around, I realized that my mind's kind of separated from having to say something that had any meaning to it. It was just, words coming out. And as each person went around, it was as if the field itself was so thick that it began to dominate the individual expressions. So that it was just like the natural movement of nature itself through each person. The mind was kind of there was no agenda, there was no getting anywhere, and it just was just like a bird chirps or a frog croaks, it was like in that circle, nature was expressing itself through each person. And the thickness of the being that connected everybody, I think, was dominant, whereas normally it's the personal expressions and the meaning and so on that grabs my attention.
I think that's switch.
Yeah, I think for me, one thing that shows up again and again is that concept of set and setting. In Trillium Awakening, actually one of a part of our name is the word awakening. And what I find when people have the mindset and they're in an environment where the setting is about awakening, it actually invites, in a very obvious and conscious way, for attention to look for the awakened state. And what I find is that, I used to think it had to be like grace. Oh, an awakened state was going to just fall on me sometime in my life. It happens to very few people. And it didn't occur to me that if I look for something that's very natural and always there, the chance of my finding it magnifies. I mean, it's much more frequent that it'll happen if I look for it than if I wait for it to land on me. And so that set and setting in Trillium work, where we actually are inviting the awakened ground state to be noticed, we could say it responds to our request, but it just said the power of our attention begins to activate it. And so then it can sometimes be, when I lead with people in groups, that sometimes just every so often, in an hour, maybe once or twice, I might say something like, can we pause for a moment and notice the larger space in which all of this is arising? And just a little invitation like that will allow people, along the lines of also what Fax was saying, other just simple sharing exercises that have kind of fertilized the space. It just comes into our awareness by our invitation. So I love that, the simplicity of our work.
Anything to add on that, Sandra? Or does that feel complete?
Oh, that was very exciting what Cielle said, because what I notice as an entry point, you mentioned that, what is a set point that will bring about the coherence? People come as individuals, and a common experience is people feel alone, a little isolated, struggling independently with their problems, and wishing that they could get rid of the things that bug them, that seem to persist. And so they do come in as individuals, but they come into the space where the individuals begin to relate to the group, the collective. And before long, people are saying, they're recognizing, oh yeah, I feel that way too. Oh yeah, that happened to me. Oh, I really get what you mean. So they begin to resonate with their individuality, their human experience, and it knits people together, this common existential reality of all of us being impacted in really predictable ways by our experience. And it pulls people together into relationship and resonance as human beings, evolving and growing and changing. And it brings about hope and just release from your isolation. I really like that about it.
Well, it's great. I'm hearing a couple threads here, like on the human side and divine side, or the spectrum of more relational and resonance, and then more like being. And I want to hear more about We Space in the context of Trillium Awakening. And I also would love for the gems that you've mined as teachers in these groups to then be shared, to be applicable to other people doing other work that's not necessarily as focused on awakening or has the same structure as you. And along that vein, one of the things that I've experienced a lot in We Space groups is there's a spectrum of people and their intentions and interests, despite the fact that we're talking about awakening. And oftentimes there's the two polarities are let's let go of our personal story and rest more into being. And let's get to a place where we really honor what's coming up right now. And at a very personal level. And when there's that stretch inside of the context, and I usually find that people that are really wanting to go to being need to go into the personal, and the people that are really stuck in personal need to get a little bit more perspective in being. But how do you navigate that as a facilitator when one person or a couple people are wanting to just go for being, and other people are really holding on to themselves? What are some things that you navigate in that situation?
Yeah, I love the question. And I also am just loving in this panel how we're actually answering the same question from different points of view. And we honor that in each other. You know, we'll typically find that we each have a native place that we'll tend to go to, but we also can speak from multiple facets. But it's lovely doing a panel, because then I know that other people will hold a position that I don't hold, or we'll actually verbalize a position that I don't natively verbalize. But in the same way, in a group situation, yes, and you've just kind of nailed it in its sort of simplistic way. Some people are more about the open to the transcendent and there's no person, and other people are more like, no, I want to be who I am in this moment and let it be expressed. And we definitely include both in the Trillium path. We tend to a little bit favor the humanness, because in many spiritual paths that is demonized. So we will actually give a little more if we need to balance the situation by encouraging that. But when we come together as a group, there are a few principles that we use. One is it's sacred time. It's a time of respect. Each person is speaking their own truth in the moment, and that needs to be received without interpretation, without bias, without advice, without trying to fix the person. And so, and then we expect instead that you hold the tension it creates in you to hear someone else talk about something that's not a pole that you represent. Can you hold the tension that it creates in you and be informed by that tension, stretched yourself by that tension that you're holding? And it's just a beautiful container that allows for everything to be there. And sometimes we might even as teachers point out, I noticed that the group is kind of holding one pole today. I want to make room in case anyone in this group might be wanting to speak from a different point of view. You are welcome here today as well.
So it sounds a lot like what Sandra was saying about weaving the inclusivity, constantly inviting the full spectrum of our experience.
Yeah.
Nice.
Fundamentally, the position that we have as teachers or facilitators is that each person's own individual expressions are right in that moment. And we're not trying to, in a sense, direct it toward any particular outcome other than to hold the whole space of the room and to allow each person to come forward with whatever is, up for them. And inevitably, there's a lot of personal stuff, and inevitably, there's also a lot of expressions of intimacy with that aspect of our identity, which is impersonal. So you have both in pretty much all of our sessions.
Yeah. As a method, you could say, or a technique to help it go more smoothly when you have a room full of people with different goals and hopes and fears, I think it helps to just name it. You might just say to the group, wow, people are here, and I'm hearing 2 really, or 3 or 4 different real strong desires in the room. One is a desire to awaken and drop the personal self. Another theme here is the desire to embody the unique, egoic, particular self. And then I hear this and that in between. And I think just for the facilitator to just name it, puts people at ease so that they are not going to then feel so oppositional to one another or in conflict. And that facilitator might even say, this is kind of like how it is in the world, right? Think when you went to your family and the different desires that were present. And then just naming it like that for the whole group can bring about an easing of those tensions, and maybe even spark, the people present thinking about, well, what else is going on in my mind besides just this one intention? Anyway, I think that the facilitator often reflecting to the group what is happening is a very important thread for keeping things moving and harmonious, even though the expressions may be very different.
So can you make like that last piece here to make that distinction between, I think a lot of times people think of coherence as harmony and equate the two. And I'm just curious, how do you support people to stay present, leaning in and in coherence when the surface features of maybe people's opinions and experiences are seemingly disharmonious or incoherent? Like the coherence within the meta coherence within the micro disharmony, so to speak.
For me, I think the teacher, the facilitator must continually call attention to that which is larger than the incoherence or the felt sense of conflict and opposition. So somehow, if the teacher can remind people present that, yeah, this is our human experience, isn't it? This occurs in our lives. This is potential or felt conflict is really part of the greater picture of who we all are, each of us in our own being. So just continually finding a way to open up the space to the next larger container or viewpoint. That's what I would do.
Nice.
Yeah. I would say just, we're named after a wildflower. Trillium's a wildflower. It has 3 petals, and each petal is an aspect of a person's identity. One petal relates to their identity as consciousness. Second petal relates to their identity as a person, and the third is their identity in relationship. And so that's the totality of the identity that we seek through these sessions to enliven and to make conscious, and so that people begin to own who they are in each of these 3 areas. And so at any time in any session that we might have, any aspect of those 3 would come up, and as teachers we realize that each one is a part of that whole person, and we welcome anything that has to do with consciousness, anything that has to do with a person's personal situation or story, and also anything that has to do with how we relate, how we come out into the world in mutuality. So all 3 of those are active and lively in our teaching.
Good. So there's been a lot of, the way that you're describing your facilitation, there's been a lot of more yin, I would say, orientation. And I know the inception of this work started as a response to hypermasculine dharmas. And I know as facilitators, you continue to go forward and you do your thing and you get to a place where I just do what I'm doing. I'm just listening to the field. And for those people that have no idea what you're talking about when you say I'm listening to the field, how do you know, what are some somatic markers or some relational field markers that says, oh, I should really be in this yin, being, holding space, being inclusive, and I need to be directive in this moment to change something because something's getting stagnant? How do you make that distinction within yourself as facilitator?
Yeah, I love that you asked, like, what are those somatic markers? And I think everyone's different. Some people will get somatic markers very easily and other people won't. But I found in my own life, it's, I can't give a general, what is a somatic marker that will work for everyone, but I do want to encourage people to look for some and look for them over time. So there's some consistency. So for instance, in my own life, I did find that the area of my heart, the whole region of my heart seems to be pretty consistently revealed to me a lot about a kind of deeper listening to than the listening that happens through my ears. It's obviously I'm hearing, but I'm seeing, and there's a feeling sense in my heart that I've begun over years of deep listening within to my environment, begun to trust. In the same way it takes a child, quite a long time to learn their colors. It's a kind of trial and error thing. As I have a grandson who's 13 months old, and I have 3 kids of my own, but it's just watching them learn. Learning takes time. Learning nuances, like a kid will learn blue very much more quickly than they learn a color like teal, or mauve. Those ones take a long time to understand those colors, if we ever do. But in the same way, we can begin to, with some help from someone who's more experienced, begin to start identify those somatic markers within ourselves that can be trusted. And of course, there's always a chance that there's some, some overlay of my own personhood, especially some unhealed wound inside of myself that can be clouding my vision. But in time, I have found just sensing in my heart has been a pretty reliable, receptive tool that then I listen to, and then I respond, and I might respond in a more feminine holding way, or I might respond in a more masculine directive way. But I first do the inner listening. And for me, it happens to be in the heart region primarily. So I would just encourage other facilitators to find, where is that inner ear, and be open to surprise and what signals it gives you.
Definitely.
I do also listen from my deepest inner sense of self, which you might call the heart of being, from that conclusive place. But I guess I would just be a little bit more, I want to comment a little bit more on how I might intervene. If I get the feeling that the person sharing is carrying out a certain trajectory of expression that is maybe old hat for them, or extremely one-sided, and maybe not livening the group. Maybe the group is sitting there and saying, yeah, we've heard this person say this before. I might just gently try to stop them and intervene with, well, I really hear you on that, but what about the point of view of blah, 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 which might be more of a confrontation or more of a teaching. But I would ask it as a question, like, in what you're saying, then how do you contemplate this idea, and then bring in the other side in such a way that you're not really cutting them down or negating what they're saying, but you're giving your own self, who's beginning to notice the stuck place, you're giving your own self the permission to intervene in a respectful way with something that might be very opposite. But asking it as a question is respectful, I think. And, it might spark or break the pattern of getting too flat. Anyway, that's what I would try.
Great. Anyone add to that, Fax?
No, I thought they said it pretty well.
Great expression.
I kind of go by my inner barometer. If I start to get upset with what somebody's saying, I'll say, what you're talking is triggering me inside. I'm feeling a little angry about, what you just said and how you responded to that. And generally that kind of brings it more into the present and into a feeling level that's alive in the present. So I kind of monitor my own personal situation and try to clarify whether it's just reactive or whether I'm responding properly. And like Sandra and Cielle were saying, it's a learning process, getting getting to know your own self-knowledge, so that you can distinguish between just a reactive expression and something that you've owned inside and are responding in an appropriate way.
That's a good segue to something else that was bubbling for me, and this is around like in psychological terms, I find that there's usually in groups one or two people that we can say have some narcissistic tendencies, where there's a disconnect in terms of their impact on other people, and it's just sort of those people that just like trigger the whole room, so to speak. How do you hold that inclusiveness for them? Because it's obviously their disconnect is coming from an attachment trauma of some kind. And how do you, in yourself, not like, okay, this person's sucking the air out of the room, I gotta take in the, how do you stay present to what's happening, and also help everyone who might be leaning towards the judgment side really be able to lean in more to the present side with somebody like that?
That's a great question. And obviously, the way we might respond to something like that will shift depending on circumstances. But in a very extreme case, I will often just, maybe not in the moment in the meeting, I'll see if there's some way I can talk to that person privately outside of the meeting. Because again, like you said, they could be very unaware of the impact they're having on the group. And just kind of clueless. And sometimes just being able to pull them aside, during a break, or even after, offering them a private session afterwards, to just say, like, I just wanted to feed back to you a little more specifically in private, the impact you're having on the group. And let's talk about that. Is that really what you're wanting? Because usually it isn't,
Right.
They want to belong often at a deeper level. So, that's kind of one way to handle it. But then how do we handle it during a group when it's maybe not so necessary to pull the person aside? I want to give room for Sandra and Fax to share on this one too, but that's just one thing that we do. But we do other things in the moment too. So
I would say that, the safety of the group is paramount, and part of the way that we structure the groups is that each person has a certain amount of time to share, so that nobody's going to be dominating beyond their 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
So that in itself helps to protect the collective field that's being generated, and keep somebody from dominating. And then as we're circling, people will automatically bring up what that person, what they felt as a result of what was shared, what was brought forward. And so the groups automatically have a kind of a balancing or monitoring effect as things go around. And I hear what you're saying. In the beginning, it used to be like that, where people could dominate, but now it's things are a lot smoother with our groups. You don't have that as much. We're more familiar with how to create a safe container to allow this magic to come forward, and so it doesn't happen that often.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I'm just kind of visualizing a group and wondering if there's enough expectation among the members that the facilitator has a little bit more leeway to intervene. And I think, sometimes it's important, like people do not appreciate if the facilitator just lets things go on and it's in a negative way. So as a facilitator, I might take the initiative and the risk to intervene in the sense of asking the speaker. It sounds like, I'd give a little reflection. It sounds like, there's some distressing feeling underneath what you're sharing. Would you want to bring that out? Or I might even ask, do you have a sense of how you're being received here in the group? And call their attention to the field. I don't know, I would try some delicate ways like that to break their litany and call them to the bigger picture, whether it's a deeper sense of wounding underneath, or a sense of how much they're not connected to the group, I would take that risk.
Which is a really quick follow-up to this, and I want to change gears here. You know, and in fact, you spoke about this a little bit when you said that you were getting angry as a hypothetical example. And, you know, I know as a facilitator, we have this authority. We can say we're in a we space, but if we're the one facilitating the group, all the authority stuff and all the projections kind of put out there, even if they're subtle. And I'm just wondering, how do you know when your response to like shift something or redirect something is coming from what wants to emerge, and what's coming from a subtle part of you that doesn't feel comfortable with a potential ambiguity and chaos this person is taking the group in? Like, how do you really balance so that you can stay neutral in your human reactivity that's inherent?
I wish I knew the answer to that question, other than trial and error and just the general growth of self-knowledge that comes with facilitating and teaching over time. You become a little bit more familiar with your trigger points, and so that you become aware of it before it reaches the point where you might say something that isn't as appropriate as it should be, or whatever. You have more wholeness in your expressions.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what it is for me.
Yeah, that's excellent. I might also say, could I just check something out? I might just like bring myself in that way, revealing my own hesitation and confusion, and asking for the group or the person who's speaking to clarify. You know, can I just check this out, because I'm not sure how I feel about that. And then I think, you know, you might get a good revelation about what's going on if you at least step in that far.
Yes.
Yeah, and then something that I might do is, rather than so much sharing what I'm feeling, not that I don't want to be transparent, but I also want to keep this space alive. And if it feels like there's tension in the room, you know, it's Sandra had said, you name it, but maybe I don't name it specifically, because I might be talking from also a very limited perspective that I'm holding at the time. But I might pause the group and say, why don't we just take a pause right now, and everyone kind of drop inside and sense what you're feeling about the space in the room right now. And then, you know, maybe again, popcorn style, people might say, I'm feeling heavy, or I'm feeling like not welcomed, or I'm feeling afraid. They might start popcorning out if permission is given, naming some of the feelings that they're feeling are in that space. And that also helps me from, you know, taking over that kind of facilitator, like, I know what's going right, that's what's right for the group, and I know what everyone's feeling, and I know the adjustments that need to be made. Mm-hmm. I invite the group into the process of sharing what it is the group is feeling around, you know, this situation that's been arising even for the group. And actually that sort of helps also me over the years fine-tune and trust my own feelings. Like, if I keep getting reflections from a group again and again and again, that sadness that I was feeling is getting really confirmed, then I start trusting it as being not a reactive, broken place inside of me, but a legitimate sensing of what's going on in the moment. So it's a kind of a learning process that we all go through together. And again, I'm never going to do it perfectly or right. There'll be inconsistencies, but over time, I think that the groups that we are with begin to also trust in the vulnerability of the leaders, the transparency of the leaders. It makes an even safer container.
That's such an important point. I've found such awkward moments in We Space groups where there was love and trust for the person that was the facilitator, but the way they're facilitating wasn't as transparent that way. So it's kind of like, I trust you, but I don't trust you. The field's not trustable. And I hear that all of you are saying it's this process of clarifying, corroborating, am I actually feeling this, or is this projection? And over time, both as a participant and as a facilitator, there's a deeper and clear understanding of like where we stand and what's the other. And of course, there's very hard to make distinctions at a certain point, but it sounds like it's an ongoing process of clarification. And And I wanted to, I've been loving all of your very skillful facilitation responses. And I know for me and for other people, when we first started facilitating in this kind of context, it can be so emergent, and we can like create a lot of structure so we can feel safe, so we know we can deliver value, or we can create a safe space, and or we can be too loose and it can be chaotic and wild in an unhelpful way. And so I would just love for you to share a few of your just like your biggest flubs and blooper reels of being a facilitator, both to normalize the developmental process for others, as well as to just realize, to help share the importance of how much growth happens as a facilitator in this work, not just Trillium Awakening, but WeSpace. And just air out your dirty WeSpace laundry as much as you feel safe to.
To me, it's kind of humorous. It was like the perfect storm. I very frequently, to kind of encourage a more informal sharing of the space that gets created in the meetings that I offer a lunch afterwards. And it just in my home, because so often people loved the community that was developed and would try to figure out what restaurant we could go to, and no one could decide. And so I'll just make a pot of soup and some salad, and we'll just share a meal afterwards. It seems so simple. So one time, a rather large group was over. I mean, by our standards, about 20 people. And at one point in the meeting, I simply said to the group, "Boy, I got to go stir the soup. Can you continue without me?" I was in the kitchen for like 3 minutes. And during that 3 minutes, someone made a comment to someone that was extremely cutting and like painful, and, just a very big you statement about how someone else was showing up. I completely didn't know it. And when I walked back in the room, they all kind of pretended like nothing had happened in a sense, except for the tension was pretty bad, and I'm trying to figure out what was going on. Now, what I regret was I didn't actually stop the group and say, what just happened? I mean, fill me in. And instead what happened is I had a lot of mopping up to do in the next week, and sometimes for the next couple of years, because someone completely lost trust in me. Even though I wasn't in the room, they still projected that I should have protected them from that comment. And, just stuff like that happens. It was kind of crazy, but what can we do? That was just underneath the surface. It was ready to come out, and it just didn't, whoever brought it out didn't feel safe to make that snarky comment when I was there. So came out on its own. Or we've had people that'll say something really cutting at it. The last, hour of a 1 week retreat. Someone just turned to someone else and like knife, and then twisted in the heart. It's real hard to mop up after things when they happen like that, especially in the groups about to disband in some way. But I'd love to hear from the others.
So just want to make sure if you're going to make soup in the middle of a group, have a soup stir that's designated. It's not
totally. I know.
Huh.
Well, one that stands out for me is we were having what we call a sitting, where people they take turns sharing, what's up for them in the moment, and each person has their own particular, direction in that sitting. And there was a couple in there, and they were having a fight. I guess were having a fight when they walked in, and so he would say something which triggered her when she said something that during their sharing they were kind of like ragging on each other, and it just got more and more intense. And so I think what I did, as I remember it, is I had them speak what they were feeling in the moment by saying, this is how I feel. This is what I'm feeling, rather than direct it to the other person. But to do it over again, it was so divisive. I would have taken them out and spoken to them, outside of the container of the group, because they were not, they were totally reactive at that moment, and it wasn't helpful to the group as a whole. It would have separated them from the group.
That's a really good point. I just want to name, I think a lot of times people are like, well, it's immersion in the WeSpace. We have to be with it. And I think it's just like a really important permission to get people to be like, what, sometimes it's just not helpful to be in a group.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of one time, several times, when a person came and kind of subtly slipped into commenting and intervening in a subtle way to add comments in. And we have a basic, principle of no crosstalk. But this person had a skill for just kind of like throwing in remarks that were crosstalk. And I don't know, I just didn't catch on. I didn't quite get it, I didn't find it that intrusive. I found it that I was able to go on and hold the thread. But then I kept hearing comments later after that meeting that this was totally unacceptable. It had enraged some people. And then I had to realize that, I'm not just able to catch everything. And I don't know what I could have done for it. I guess I could encourage people to take a risk and bring it up in the moment, in the group, rather than letting it go and then later becoming resentful. But that was one time when I didn't catch on, and the word got back to this person because later it didn't happen so frequently. But that was a big reaction among several people for a while. And another time, a reaction that was more decisive was I misread how sensitive someone was to having their complaining and dramatizing of victimhood interrupted. And I kind of like tried to point out, well, what was happening in their whole life that was worthwhile. And that also backfired because, people can become kind of righteous about whatever rules or baselines you've set up for your group. And if those baselines are violated, then they get on the facilitator, and you didn't hold the line and blah, 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 or they feel, oh, that was just terrible. So there's, I guess, to expect that whatever set points you've established, that some people really adhere to those as very important. And if they wobble a bit, it's not acceptable. So I don't know how to deal with that. But to just continue to try to keep people being a little flexible, holding the standards, but not rigidly. And that's educating people over time. But yeah, that's happened.
Nice.
Michael, could I add something here?
Please, yeah, I was going to ask that actually.
Oh, just, one term that we use, and it has to do, we don't use this same framework, phrase, but it still will work here, to green light. So the word green light is just say hello, give a green light to, say yes to whatever is emerging. So we could call it green lighting what's emerging. And the thing is that what we also talk about in our teaching is that we totally green light whatever feelings are arising in you. And we also want to green light what's even underneath those feelings. It's like we don't stop with what's surfaced. It's actually, can we green light what's just below the surface and what's just below that and just what below that? It can be a beautiful thing of self-discovery. Whereas if we just only green light what's emerged, we don't often learn a whole lot new. It's what's underneath it where it can be really juicy for the individual. Now, the other thing that's really important in our group is we don't green light all behavior. So I could be feeling really, really angry and really, really pissed out, and I need to tell the group how angry I am, but I don't have to enact it on the group. I don't have to like splash it all over the group in a sense. I don't have to hold the group hostage in my expression. And so we're constantly looking for that please stay with your feelings. They are perfectly valid in this thing, but let's look for the expression of it in a way that doesn't actually cause damage to the group that's here. And, so we're always trying to dance that, green-lighting what's emerging, but watching for appropriate expression of what's emerging. But even more important than that, what has not yet emerged that's underneath what surfaced, because that, following that thread down, usually within the person, somatically, emotionally, psychospiritually, can be so majorly transformative, not just for the person, but for the group as well. So, that can be a redirect. What's underneath that?
Right. So I'm curious around, Sandra, I know, is a psychotherapist. I don't know. Cielle, you're not a psychotherapist, are you? Are you trying to say that? So you all in Trillium Awakening are inviting some inviting everything, anything that's coming up. And so I'm curious for those that maybe, in many cases I've been in groups where it's just like we tap into a state of being and all this awareness comes into the room and all of a sudden people are just like popping off in terms of getting triggered and reactive and so forth. And it's kind of a two-part question. One part is how do you know when you're over your head of your competency holding a group? And also related to this, I feel like so much of our parenting that we've all gone through, even if it's in different generations, has a core of shame in it. Mm-hmm. And I find that as facilitators, when we get overwhelmed, there's a tendency to sort of like close things down, like, well, okay, that was really good, but yeah, like just these little ways that we bring shame in. So it's like, how do we know when we're over our head, and how do we basically not use shame to close it back down so we feel better about ourselves?
I'll jump back in again. I mean, one thing that I love about this work is we are a group of teachers. There's over 40 of us. And we have a lot of agreements with each other. And so one of the agreements is that newer teachers teach with someone who's more senior for the most part. And they're still in supervision with a teacher. Even when they teach on their own, they're under supervision from a teacher where they do a lot of debriefing. Mm-hmm. And in larger groups where things could get more volatile, we usually do teach in teams. Sandra and Fax and I and a couple other teachers here in Fairfield teach us teams often, all the time. And during the longer events, we have debriefings amongst the teachers, every couple of days. We'll have very formal debriefings, as well as we'll check in with each other. We also have once a month, we have what we call a mutuality group. We use the word mutuality more than we space. It's just our kind of little version of it, that where's this mutual space that's between us. Mm-hmm. But all teachers are required to go to a mutuality group meeting with other teachers, usually done by Zoom or something like that, once a month. And you never get, grow out of that need to be in pure relationship. And that's where you start talking about things where someone else will check into you and say, I think you're over your head with this, really give very, frank feedback. And sometimes we just talk about, what's going on in our own life. Oh, my grandson visited last week. That was cute. But we're tracking each other, month by month, year by year, and holding each other accountable for, and having, once a year retreats where we do advanced trainings. So we're not just kind of on our own here. There's a lot of group support. And I love that about this work. Mm.
Yeah, I could never have done this without, support over, half a decade of being in these small groups myself, seeing how they were held by the teachers, being exposed to a variety of situations that would come up. And so it's a learning experience. And before I became a teacher, I interned for a couple of years. This is a long-term thing. And so you're exposed to a lot of different situations and had supervision with you. So I think it took about 7 or 8 years of that immersion in the work before I became a teacher. And even then I was, as Cielle was saying, I'll be paired with people who are more senior to myself. So that's and then the monthly check-ins with other teachers to kind of refine our skills and to discuss, situations that come up. So it's something that you're not holding by yourself. You have 40 other teachers there, supporting you all along the way.
Mm-hmm. Does that feel complete, Sandra?
Well, I'm kind of pondering what you brought up, and I do have to admit that there are moments in certain groups, especially where people are coming in that haven't attended on a regular basis, or they may be coming into even an advanced group and they've had a lot of their own practice for years. And sometimes there's a feeling that they already know how a group should be facilitated and what should happen. And I have been in a tight place where I felt like the previous mindsets between our group and that group that they're representing have not been opened up and explored, but the projection is that you are making a big mistake. And it is very, very, I don't know, it's very upsetting to not have the time to unpack it and to have people that are really florid about what's going on. And the only thing I can think is to somehow like name that and slow things down and try to stay in relationship with people that are splitting or blaming, and try to hold your tongue and not assert your own standards so strongly that others feel shame. But that's really difficult. It just happens now and then, you know. And the main thing I can think of is to slow things down. Let's take our time here. Let's step back for a moment. Let me, and clarify. Is this what you're meaning? Or is this what you're holding as your value? You know, and just do your best to try to clarify your terms and, you know, open up that accusation or that feeling of people having done something wrong. And I don't know, it's tricky. It does happen now and then.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think more than anything, I'm just wanting to hear from, you know, people who've been doing this for a long time, so that the newbies out there can be like, oh, well, it's just par for the course. And I hear that a lot of what you're saying here is taking a long-term view, getting lots of support and feedback from others, and committing to being this, as opposed to getting skillful. It's more like I'm being this, rather than I'm just trying to have some sort of static goal of being a good facilitator. Just feels like everyone, the theme here just feels like the journey that continues to get more skillful and has all sorts of unskillful things popping up along the way, of course.
Right. Yeah.
And along that same vein, in terms of collaboration, I know fairly recently, as Trillium Awakening emerged from Waking Down to Mutuality and began to shift its organizational structure, you know, originally it was one or two teachers who are hierarchically above others, and now it's the 40 plus teachers that are in collaboration. And it's kind of a nice mirror in some ways to the we space. And one of the questions that I've had in we space is, you know, what's the functional hierarchy that serves, and how do we get everyone voices into the space that doesn't just clog everything up, so we're all just talking about our feelings and nothing gets focused on or done. And so it seems like there's a rich landscape of 40, I'm sure, very unique, very strong-willed, although open-hearted teachers. And what have been some of the things that you've learned about collective leadership and the challenges of that and the benefits of that as you've come together as this leadership team of 40 plus teachers?
Yeah, we're still learning for sure. Especially because it's only a couple of years ago that we did lose our kind of focal leader, that we, even though we always have wanted to be very democratic, there was that, you know, perceived leader for quite some time when Samuel Bonder was directing this work, but we have since split off. And so we're still learning about leadership. One of the one of the values, though, too, of having 40, I love you said, like, strong, powerful, maybe even sometimes headstrong leaders, and how to bring them together is we also happen to have a few members in our group that are really skilled in certain areas. So one of the persons, Deborah Boyer, who co-authored the article that's in your book with Sandra Glickman, she introduced to us a form of governance. It's called holacracy. It's just brilliant. And so that is a way of governing our teacher circle that is very, very effective. We've been using it for a few years now. There's that. We also have a woman, a teacher, one of our teachers in England, who works for an organization. I don't have her permission right now to say the organization, but it's one that's been she's been working with them for 30 years, and they really focus with other worldwide organizations about issues of authority that always happen within any structured system. She said authority does arise, it gets questioned. When it's clarified, there's much more purposefulness in that organization. So she's helping us to clarify just basics that her company, she's not the founder, but she's a member of, and one of their researchers, has just found consistently. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are certain things about hierarchy and authority that just happen. We've also got a brilliant PhD student who understands spiral dynamics and can especially apply them to our particularly unique group. And so he's helping us with that. And so we have inside the group a lot of brilliance, and we're beginning to mine that brilliance to help us with structuring our own leadership. And it's evolving, especially in this last year. So I'd love to come back with you in 5 years and tell you what we've mined from this, but because it's kind of raw materials, but I think we're going to form them into diamonds and gold, and it's going to be really exciting.
Cool.
Yeah.
I love what Cielle is saying. This is actually the composite picture of where we are. But at our recent teacher retreat, we did have a couple of people who have worked with organizations design a process that the teachers at the retreat went through. And it lasted over 2 days. It included elements of, it was kind of like a super empowered we space that also had specific exercises for the entire group, and exercises which included like levels within the group, so that level by level we surfaced feelings, we surfaced attitudes, we surfaced desires and experience. And by the end of 2 days, it was incredibly rich. And we had discovered a forward thrust that was very rich and very nuanced. And so I know we'll use that sort of thing again. It had something to do with U theory, which coaching people had worked before. But it was like you begin with the past, you begin with the feeling level, you surface that, you work it in different groups of people until you hit the bottom. And then at a certain point, there's a turning, and there becomes a building forward that everyone contributes to. And you end up, maybe you're going the same direction, but you've filled it out with the reality of what you've been through. And everyone then has been included. And it's quite empowering. It's amazingly empowering. So we are discovering ways to work with 44 different people who are, collaborating in the leadership. It is a unique unfolding, I think. I'm not entirely sure about that, but it's been very, very wonderful and revealing.
Great.
And it's been very challenging too, not to have one or two people as the governing hierarchy, the top of the hierarchy. That's clear. It's not as difficult because the decisions can be, more clear. But when you have so many people, you really have to work it. You really have to work it in mutuality in the we space. But I think we're doing well. And I feel a lot of confidence in the direction that we're heading.
Nice. And you want to add to that, Fax?
Yeah, I would just say it's, you know, it's where the rubber meets the road, like you were saying. There's a lot of groups that focus on developing consciousness, awakening to consciousness. There's a lot of groups that are involved in embodiment. And I think our group is more involved with relatedness and mutuality. And this is just one aspect of it. You know, how do we relate within ourselves as 44 strong teachers to come to decisions and divide up the responsibilities and all of that. And so this is something that we've been working with the last couple of years, and it's starting to pay dividends now. And I think it's going to impact our work going forward, because this is ultimately, you know, taking the awareness, taking the self-knowledge and bringing it into the world so that people can relate to each other in a way that's positive and forward-moving. And that's for us, that's what we call mutuality, and that's the last frontier. And we have to connect within ourselves first before we can bring it out, and that's what's happening.
Right.
It's a true democratic circle now that we've created.
Well, you know, I really just, the biggest theme that's just emerging for me throughout this whole conversation is devotion. You know, how much devotion you all have to this work and to your own journey and to the feminine, all these things, to we space, all these things. It's just really, really beautiful. I wanted to name that. And then I have just one final question to take us home, which is, I'm going to kind of it's going to be a little bigger of a frame, and you can just sort of find where in that frame you'd like to answer from. And that is basically the future. You know, Cielle mentioned exciting to come back in 5 years to see what the structure and organization looks like. And I'm just curious, what's most exciting to you about the future of this work, or the future of we space in the context of this work, or the impact of this work on humanity? So any of those things, feel free to answer what most excites you about the future around this work.
All of the above. The future of this work on humanity, you know, the value of the collective consciousness being generated from each other, the trust that elicits, the holding of the love that can be created within the group. It's certainly something that's needed in the world more than anything else, and this is our little piece of it, and so we're riding it.
Nice.
I think one thing that's exciting me about this work, you know, this work of embodied mutuality, walking a path of awakening, is that we collectively now have enough experience of walking that path of embodied awakening in mutuality for well over a decade, actually spanning about 2 decades. And so what we're just beginning to do, so this is why it's so exciting to me, because it's just emerging, is to map out what are descriptions of a more advanced awakened state, human embodied state. So often we have these, you know, books, especially Asian books, that talk about these pinnacle awakenings that are very not embodied, you know, very just transcendent. And we don't have a lot of maps for what a human, divinely human embodied awakening can look when someone's been walking that path for 10, 20 years. But we're getting enough, you know, just data, human data, that we're starting to map out what starts opening, what potential's opening. The realm of life is so huge. You know, what we consider consensual reality is such a small percentage of life. It's an important percentage of life, but it's actually quite small. What starts opening up as we walk a divinely human path of embodied awakening over time? And so, yeah, there's members of our group right now that are just beginning to start naming and then fleshing out those descriptions of where people might themselves find themselves growing into, because any one person isn't probably going to grow into all of these realms in a lifetime. But they'll start finding, oh yes, that is opening in me.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to actually have, when it's named, it can be welcomed even more. It can be allowed to emerge even more. We can get support for it even more. So that's super exciting to me, that we're just beginning to catalog and eventually map higher dimensions of human life.
Mm.
So again, talk to us in 5 years. I'm stoked on this one.
Well, I've had a moment to think while the two of you were sharing. And of course, I love what you're expressing. But I find my particular interest in this unfolding, evolutionary path of Trillium Awakening, I find my interest to be in developing, expressing, articulating how does enlightened organization unfold? What are the structures required? What are the discriminations that need to come online? How can we accommodate people with many different kinds of skills and not exclude their gifts and expertise? So I'm really interested in developing enlightened organization from the bottom up, I guess I would say.
Mm. Well, it's so beautiful. I appreciate the ending note on that, and I want to just add my own. I haven't been in a sitting in this context of this work for several years. But when I did, it was just deeply nourishing. So if anybody who's listening is hearing what you're saying, is like, wow, that seems like a really great space, I can confirm that it is, and definitely recommend people checking out this work. And again, I want to thank you all for your devotion in terms of being here, spending the time to do this, and to be so devoted to your own path and the flourishing and the flowering of this work. And if you'd like to learn more about this work, you can go to trilliumawakening.org, which you can find bios of all these lovely humans there, and ways to access connecting to this work. So just want to, again, thank you all for being here and for all that you're doing in the world. And may, again, our conversation that we've had today be of benefit to many, many beings as they walk their path of being divinely human. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Beautiful facilitation of this.